Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. There's a question we get probably at least 5 times a day here at Personality Hacker, and I suspect this is a question that a lot of people in type leadership get often. And that is, does your personality type change? Does it change at all? Like, does it change over the course of your lifespan? Is it inevitable that it changes, or can it change? And we get this question so often that the last time we received this question, I went to go reference the podcast in which we had talked about this subject, only to discover that in over 300 episodes, we've never directly addressed this question of, does personality type change? Coincidentally, while I was looking up, sort of doing a generic Google search to look up our own content to see, to reference the person to the podcast, around this time period, there is a study, actually a person is releasing a book that asserts that yes, personality does change over your life. But the prevailing theory in the personality type world is that it does not. So I took this article, I kicked it over to our friend, Dr. Dario Nardi, and I asked him what was his opinion on it. And he gave me back this really awesome email with lots of great information in it. And I showed it with you, Joel, and both of us looked at each other and were like, if we're going to address this topic, we have to invite Dario on. So I'd like to introduce our very good friend, Dr. Dario Nardi, who will be interviewing in this podcast about the topic, does personality type change? So welcome to the show, Dario.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you.
So, Dr. Nardi, does personality change? I mean, I know we're going to talk about this through the entire episode. How should we approach this, basically? You've done a lot of brain scanning research. You've done things with cognitive functions by hooking EEG machines to people's brains. You're looking at some of the science. There's, we talked when you were at one of our live events, there's a lot of pressure on your shoulders in some ways. Oh, Dr. Nardi's going to really prove scientifically about type. We've had all these different conversations around this. You've done research and things of this nature. What's your perspective and where are you coming from when you approach these topics?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I would say I come from it from 3 or 4 directions. And one of those is getting at what do we mean definitionally when we say personality or change or development? And sort of philosophically, where does that all fit? Is development something that happens systemically, within society, or is it just within the person? Very different from saying just that something changes. And then there's the second thing is the scientific element. So there are studies which have validated, the classic concepts of personality, like the Minnesota genetic twin study, which was done with both MBTI and 5-factor model. Other things, science also, I've had now enough of a database to look at people of different ages and career backgrounds and so on to understand what is the impact of these other variables that might be going on: culture, career, sex, age. And then I think the third piece is what are the benefits? What are we trying to get when we're working with somebody? And why is it that we're using something like the Myers-Briggs, or I would say the Jungian framework, larger framework, as opposed to looking at traits or something like that? What is our goal? Do we want to help people develop? And if we're doing that, what is the most effective and ethical way to do that? So those are the 3 angles that I'm looking at.
So let's start with the first one, because I think that's the best. That actually think is the foundational component to all of this, which is defining our terms. When somebody asserts that absolutely personality changes over a lifetime versus people in the type community that assert that it does not, let's define the term of what personality is versus maybe say personality type.
Yeah, absolutely. So the classic definition of personality in academic, textbook is going to be a stable set of characteristics or a stable set of traits. So by definition, personality is meant to indicate the things which are stable. So when a person comes out, having looked, not from the type community, but from academic community, saying that personality changes, they're actually also really pushing boundaries and raising a flag, trying to change people's minds. An important part of that when we say stable traits or characteristics is that's what they're looking at. They're not looking at types, although occasionally they might, if they do factor analysis or something, clusters of traits as they define it. But the trait model is primarily behavioral or, sort of surfacey. because the academic psychology, the personality psychology, wants to look at things that are measurable. So they're not interested in, say, what the folks do in cognitive science for the most part, which is mental processes. And then when we talk about psychological type, which is what Carl Jung was interested in, which is not personality. Personality is just like an echo of the psychology. The psychological type is something that's systemic. So think of like an ecology, like a forest and animals and trees, and they all interrelate and support each other. And then, what I like to say is that in terms of terms, is the difference when we talk about traits. It's like when we go to the market and we want to bake a pie, and we're just asking, like, what are the best qualities we want in an apple in order to bake a good pie? It's the same thing as like, what kind of traits do we want in somebody to make a good salesperson or whatnot? And apple is crispy and it's a red or green, like whatever it is. But I think what people who are interested in type are interested in are really the patterns and the processes that are going on in the psyche, stuff about development, and they want to be raising orchards, and that might be just nurturing their own apple tree, or in an organizational setting, if they're going to become a coach or a therapist, it's really about being a good orchard manager. And so that's in terms of terms, I think that it's important to distinguish what we're talking about. And then the other thing is change. Change is not the same as development. Change, is just something that's we're moving from A to B to Q to X to 4, whatever it is. And development is applying that we're going somewhere, that there's some kind of maybe not purposeful activity, but there's a fulfillment of something. The same way that if I plant a tree, in fact, let's say 2 trees, and one of the seeds is for an oak tree and the other one is for a pine tree, that development occurs. And the oak tree doesn't change into a pine tree later in life, or vice versa. In fact, nothing we can do can change them. But at the same time, the development means they're going to sprout, they're going to be saplings, they're going to grow into young adult trees, they're going to become older trees that have a bark, and how they behave and what happens changes in a way that's a developmental life cycle. And so that's what I feel type is about. That type is not just about personality. It could be with MBTI, and that's often what we hear in the news, MBTI. But MBTI is just like an instrument to gather a data point, and it is about personality. But most people in type, they want to know about the psychology part, the Jungian part, and they're interested in that development, the fulfillment of the pattern of the self.
One of the best ways to see the difference between change and development is to talk to, like in the terms that we use, because we're all familiar in using Myers-Briggs as a system, to talk to somebody who is an undeveloped or maybe even unhealthy version of a type, and then go talk to somebody who is a healthy and developed version of the exact same type. And you will see so many different patterns showing up and so many different characteristics. You could almost say that there are 2 different types, but one is a developed version. And so that I like the illustration of the difference between development and change. Like the pine tree is not going to become an oak tree, but it's going to become the manifest version of the pine tree. And so I think that that's a really good illustration. I think one of the challenges that people outside of type have, and oftentimes when on the outside looking in, one of the maybe criticisms that they assert is this idea that if you get too attached to maybe say characteristics around a personality type or an identity around it, it can put you in a fixed mindset. Like you don't give yourself room to have development or change or growth. But I think that oftentimes that goes into the realm then of identity. So can you talk a little bit about how you see the difference between personality and personality type, which you just flayed out beautifully, but then also this idea of identity and whether or not type or characteristics around personality types might put somebody in a fixed mindset around their identity associated with that type?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, wonderful points. This is why I feel today that one of type's superpowers, so to speak, is that it's a developmental model, unlike, say, 5-factor model. And that if we want to talk about personality in a meaningful way, we really need to talk about development and make development part of the conversation, which is why the current project I've been working on, this Magic Diamond thing, is really about creating a space whenever we're going to look at personality, like sensing versus intuiting is usually a way of framing things. It's like, well, there's sensing and there's intuiting, and then when they overlap in that Venn diagram, like what is created out of that, and what can we create? So what you said about like growth mindset versus fixed mindset and identity, I mean, that's a developmental issue, and anyone, can have this sort of this fixed mindset, and they may even be changing some of their traits, like going into an office environment and realizing like, oh, I need to be more organized. I haven't been working in a place with other people before, and so on. What kind of process are they using? And that's like learning a skill. And I can learn, more guitar as a skill or whatever it is. But then this growth mindset is really saying like, I want to allow a new space in myself for something to transform, to change, to improve, to blossom. And so when we talk about healthy versus unhealthy, I absolutely agree. There are times when people can look very different, and supposedly, they read the same type description and they say yes, and on the outside they seem very, very different. Does that mean maybe we should call them different types or something like that? I really don't think so, because if we're in the job seriously of assisting people with development, we need to have a solid understanding of where it is that they're starting, so that the development is congruent with, we're talking about identity, is congruent with their starting point and who they are. So type falsification is a great example. All of these personality assessments, it doesn't matter what they are, could be DISC, 5-factor, MBTI, they rely upon self-report. Some of them also bring in 360 evaluation, but the model is self-report. And then people, when they self-report, especially if they don't feel free to report who they are, or maybe they actually don't have a sense of it for whatever reason, they're not coming with a language to be able to respond, or a way to respond, that you have what's called type falsification. And that can easily happen. I talked to a colleague who worked in China, facilitating managers to go into the leadership positions, and they took the MBTI, all of them. I don't remember how many, several hundred, and over 90% scored as ISTJ. They are not over 90% ISTJ. By the end of the course, most of them realized that actually they had some other type preference, but in fact they were just simply folding to what the expectation was. Oh, I'm supposed to be this way, or whether that's ideal or this is what they're expecting people to see. So I don't think we can just chart a shift in traits. That's really not ideal. That we want to know change occurs in a context. So what is that context? What is the core self? So we remain congruent with that. Because if we don't, it's like building on a weak foundation. Or we're going to say we're going to build a skyscraper on a foundation that was meant for a factory or whatever it is. So it's more than drift. And it's also more than fitness with respect to the environment. Because people are more than just like, oh, I'm well suited to my environment. This idea of individuation in Jung, all of his work, I mean, even the type work, was about therapeutic issues. Is like people become one-sided, and how do we help them overcome that one-sidedness? I mean, it's useful being right-handed or left-handed. You pick a hand, it's useful, but you want to have both hands. And then stuff like shadow and projection and so on. These are real phenomena that most people in personality don't consider. So like the book that you were talking about that's coming out, I mean, it's a great article. The article is not hostile to type or whatnot. But the author completely misses that there's this really like therapeutic human dimension. That it's not just like, oh, I shifted on the EI dimension or something like that, which is very trait-based thinking. It's really like, am I overcoming one-sidedness? Where am I projecting, and so on. So we want to make sure that when we're working with people, that they understand where they are in their development, and that we take a systemic approach, and that they really like type empowers people to have a growth mindset.
I think what's interesting about this is a couple different things jump out at me as you're talking. The first one is oftentimes what people define as a change of personality is actually greater self-awareness, awareness of oneself in one's environment, which alters and changes, and then growth and development, becoming like a more manifest version of yourself as your awareness or self-awareness is also growing. And so where you're at the beginning of that journey can look very different than where you're at the end of that journey, to a point where somebody on the outside that doesn't have as deep an understanding or awareness of these systems might say that that's a change, where really that might just be a natural growth path. And I think one of the things I've observed is that most of the time when there's criticism of the system, the person who's criticizing it, even if they're not hostile, oftentimes lacks an understanding of the depth of what you're talking about, things like the cognitive functions, and that the etymology of all of this was actually meant for therapy and to develop and to look at those aspects. And so if they don't have a complex or deep understanding of the system, and they observe other people not having deep or complex understandings of the system, then it's really easy to stay at that level and go, oh, well, everybody's just over-identifying with these very shallow traits or markers. And so then they throw the system out or the tool of the system, they throw the tool out because of inept handling from other people and themselves. And so what I'm kind of getting from what you're talking about is that if you don't conflate greater self-awareness and development for change, if you understand that that's simply development, and you take a more complex view or a greater understanding of this tool and don't basically blame the tool because of handling, then you're probably going to come to a very different conclusion on all of this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's so to go back a little bit in terms of the change over the long period of time and the study that's being mentioned and personality changes. I mean, for one, they were looking primarily at traits that were things like confidence, the belief in themselves and stress handling capacity, all of those things. And those are not the same thing as, say, sensing, intuiting, thinking, feeling. Like they're really like they're measuring developmental aspects of the self, which I think is great. It's great to see that for the large part, these people coming from a poor background in the UK, that they were able to develop these skills over a lifetime. And I don't know if skills is the right word. I mean, but they were developing a growth mindset, or at least at some point they did, and they improved. In terms of the science of it, the Minnesota twin study, which looked at identical twins who were raised apart, that they used both a 5-factor and MBTI, and found that for both assessments, both models, that the inheritance, the DNA, played 40 to 60% role in the adult person's makeup. So we know that even if personality in the sense of traits changes, and we shouldn't be surprised by that, that there still is this very strong genetic basis, this core self that's there that's going to push a person in a particular direction. And then there's this wonderful, I really commend the folks in the UK. There's this UK household longitudinal study, which I think they had an original part that they began like 75 years ago, and then another one that was like 30 years ago. And so longitudinal meaning that they're coming back to people every 5 years or so to seeing how they're doing. And they found that at these quote short intervals of 5 to 10 years, that people's traits did not change that much. That Joe at age 30 and Joe at age 40 were largely the same. And so this really bolstered the idea for decades with the older longitudinal study that in fact these traits are stable. But then what they found when they really had gone the whole 70 years, that from childhood to old age, that at each point the change was not that much, but over the course of a lifespan, people often moved in a completely opposite direction. Those who, like, for example, incredibly valued openness or conscientiousness, that they were less conscientious in the sense of being more relaxed. Those who were more neurotic became less neurotic. I hope that those who were less neurotic didn't become more. I'm not sure how that worked. But, that's one of the challenges with the trait models. Is that there was this change, and I can certainly see between myself at age 5 and 20 and then 50 that there are actually there are qualities that I have now that are more in common with me at age 5 than at age 20. And that reminds us that there are also these developmental windows, psychologically speaking, not just cognitive skills like language use, but psychologically speaking. And there is this capacity for change. And then I want to temper that by saying, the change is always occurring within the context that we started with. And it does seem like, genetics, let's say, is 40 to 60%. We'll just call that 50% for convenience. And then what happens in the first 2 years or the first 8 years or whatnot then forms like this bowl, and then everything happens more or less within the context of that bowl. So the childhood environment, the infant environment, does seem like that's very important. And I do believe that there are people who, by their mid-30s, more or less crystallize, and they, even if they had a growth mindset earlier in life, things are working pretty well in their environment, and there doesn't seem like a reason to grow any further. So for the next 40 years, maybe until something really challenges them, that they remain more or less where they are. So it's not like this is, we're all set that we're going to develop or something like that. I think the development is always relative to the environment that is pushed on us. And that was the point of the article that you sent me. He was saying that personality can change when we change the environment. And I'm absolutely on board with that. Everything that we know, for example, inner city youth who have behavioral problems, you take them out to the countryside to work with animals, and literally within like 24 hours, if not 3 days, their behavioral problems disappear. And it may be that really they needed a change of environment, and in fact that this natural environment was more suited to them. The environment we all evolved in. So this idea of thinking of personality as systemic, or that it's ecological, and that your environment, it impacts what happens to you. And this is one reason why I remember my 40s better than my 30s, because I traveled a lot more in my 40s and really pushed myself to do things that I didn't do in my 30s. So having a new routine is great. Going to a new job is great. Those are all little things. Can we, I think travel, like if you go and live in a new culture, oh my goodness, that can be a huge impact. That we need to have this growth mindset to push ourselves if we want to, and many people don't have that luxury because they have kids and they have a job and obligation. And, America works like a pressure cooker, historically. And so that's, maybe then what we can do is we can look at things like neotropics and psychedelics as showing that they can actually promote neuron growth and actually get us to our brains to be like when we were teenagers, which is a whole nother topic, and I should give you all time to respond.
So environment then is very important based on what you're saying, but you just kind of alluded to this idea of something that's inherited. You said, like, let's just call it 50%. I think you're referencing a study maybe out of the University of Minnesota, or where they basically took identical. Could you address that study specifically? Because I think that's a really interesting study.
Yeah, I don't have the reference for it right up, but I know over the years I've Googled it multiple times as the Minnesota twins study. And I know it's in the type Milo database, which is part of the Center for Application of Psychological Type. And that they, over the course of, imagine, that you have identical twins, and then for whatever reason, they're given up for adoption or something like that, and they're raised by different families, potentially in different states or whatnot. And people, time and again, there are shows that have been done about this, even, showing how, two guys named Joe and Mike both ended up marrying blondes who were named Suzanne, and they bought Mustangs, even though they hadn't met each other until they were 35 years old or something like that, which is a little creepy in some ways. And so what is the chance that they're going to score identically in terms of personality traits or in terms of psychological type? And it really looks like there's a 40 to 60% contribution of genetics to get them to be scoring the same type. In fact, it's quite likely, far more than chance, that you're going to end up with, say, two ESTJs or two INFPs or whatever, both of them scoring the same way, or interestingly scoring exactly opposite, which it reminds us that there is this environmental role that maybe happens in the womb or in the first 2 years, whatever it is. So there are these studies that have been going on really trying to answer this question. It is somewhat speculative question, but I also believe that we have all the information we need. In terms of like genetic contribution, in terms of the longitudinal study. Where I would add something is in terms of brain imaging, that although I, for the most part, have not followed people longitudinally, I have people who have scored as the same personality type. In other words, one of 16 categories. And looking at their, of course, gathering the demographics and looking at what's happening in their brains in terms of not just brain activity, but brain wiring as they do this like 1 hour protocol. And also, coming from different countries. So I have a meaningful enough number of people from the UK, Norway, France, Australia, India, Mumbai, India, and then in the United States. And so it definitely looks like, what is that 50% that's not the inborn part? And it could be that, type is largely, I don't want to say inborn. Jung had no particular, stance on that. But what is the part that's not inborn, and how is it going to play into development? I found culture makes a difference. If you show me 5 different brain maps from a different country, like France versus the UK, actually there is something that's quite common, not all the time, but common in British brains that doesn't appear in French or American brains. The same for the French. Is not deterministic, but it's definitely a big statistical cue, the kind that would be like, oh, I could put money down on that. It seems like for younger people, when I look at 60 ENFPs and we compare the young ones versus the older ones, sex plays a difference for male versus female. I'm talking about biological, and it's, somebody once asked me about intersex, and I'm like, I don't know. Like, I haven't had any intersex clients. That they're definitely for the first, like age 15 to 25, that's a big impact. And then career choice. Is it going to be in the humanities, the arts, the social sciences, helping professions? On the one side, that's like one kind of brain in a way. It pushes the brain in one direction. And then there's like STEM, business, the law, that kind of thing in the other direction. And that seems to override the impact of sex by the time that people get to midlife. And so career has a big impact. So I think it's fair to say, that maybe we really do need to go beyond 16 types many times, not to get into traits or whatever, but to acknowledge that career, sex, culture, and then eventually midlife. And I really have seen in the brain what's going on with people at midlife. And that's a whole other topic. But we really when we look at the science, we really can address this in a lot of interesting ways and say that, it's great when people have this self-discovery opportunity. Oh my God, this is who I am. And the wonderful thing about type is you're sort of putting that finger to the wind, and then you can reveal a lot more about the person, what's going on underneath. But, really then what is the next step? How are we going to use this information? And then it becomes a coaching tool, and it becomes a jumping off point for people to develop the growth mindset and to actually grow in a direction that's healthy for the oak tree or healthy for the pine tree, and not to just be, oh, like, what do you think you need? Because it's nice to have the subjective reference point to say, like, well, this thinking dimension is so one-sided in its development, feeling is coming through, but how and where, and is it in a healthy way, and do we need to address that? And that's yeah.
Well, so I think you're on board with, I think all of us have had conversations offline about this, that there's this attitude of growth that we like to show up to type with. And I think the metaphor that's coming up for me is, and the distinction you're making is, let's not look at type as a label we put on ourselves or others. It's more of a map of where we can go. It's more of a map of what we can develop and how we can approach life and our own personal development.
Yeah, absolutely. To add an additional metaphor to that, Linda Behrens has talked about type as a lens, language, and lever. The lens part is like when we're working with other people or looking in the mirror, it gives us a way to see what's going on, to understand what's going on. And then the language is like, well, how do we get started in talking to each other or doing research or, on a team, like whatever it is, besides saying like, that she's a very neat person or he's nasty or whatever it is, like, can we get beyond that? And then the lever part is the growth part.
So I think we've basically covered all three of the elements you mentioned at the beginning. We've defined our terms and talked a little like the difference between personality type, and identity. We talked about some of the scientific components of it, which I think is, for a lot of people, particularly critics, that's one of the big things that that is causes them to pause, which is this idea of is whether or not it's scientific. And I think with a more shallow understanding or awareness of the purpose of type, I think it appears unscientific. But we've addressed this before in previous podcasts that it's not unscientific. It's just in an infancy state of understanding or being understood through scientific frame. But I think that that's part of what's so exciting about some of the work you're doing and some of the work that people through different associations are doing, is that that's becoming a little less obfuscated. But I think the third component that you were mentioning at the beginning, goal of type, or the goal that we all have in this, that's what we're sort of addressing right now, which is this idea of using it as a developmental model. And so I want to really maybe go down that road a little bit more of the goal of type, even though it's been touched on throughout this entire podcast, which is that it's not intended to give somebody ammunition to continue a fixed mindset. It's not intended to be a one and done label and, like you've been rubber stamped and then now you're off on your way to know the completion of who you are. The goal of type for all of us is, as Joel mentioned, a map, or maybe just like a way of being able to diagnose elements that might not be understood by other things that are diagnostic. Like it's a node in the system of who you are, but it's not the complete type. So in that vein of talking about growth and talking about the goal of type, can you discuss a little bit about what you hinted at the beginning? You called it the magic diamond, and you've explained this to Joel and I, but for the person listening, can you explain a little bit about what that magic diamond is? And then we can talk about some exciting news that's coming out in July.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So there's somebody sort of randomly, I suppose this was the benefit of occasionally looking at Facebook, posted something by the work of Sandra Bem, who was a feminist in the 1970s, and she did her dissertation work on masculinity and femininity, and saw them not as a polarity along a spectrum, but instead is like XY axes on a plane. And for people trying to visualize that, it's imagined there's this I don't want to go into a diamond quite yet. We'll just say a napkin or piece of paper. And along one axis, one side is masculinity and the other side is femininity. However we want to define those, wherever they come from, that's not the question. She said, what's interesting is that, both of those can be undifferentiated in a person. When they're born, like what exactly are they coming with? It's something, but then a person can develop along a particular spectrum, in one direction or the other, but they're still just walking on the edge of the napkin. And isn't the interesting part when we bring it together that a balanced person has elements of both? And I immediately thought, there's very much what Carl Jung's work was about, that in talking about men and women and the anima and the animus, is that actually we have qualities of both within us, and do we want to create space for the other side of us to come out? So for a typical male, there's this, certain, it depends on the culture, of course, and other things about them, but is there, whatever their opposite is, are they going to allow that to come out, the anima to emerge? And what does that take? So her work looked at that, and she developed an assessment around that. And it really got me thinking, instead of thinking of, in trait theory, there's just something like neuroticism on a scale from like 0 to whatever. And neuroticism doesn't exist with respect to anything else, which is a very sort of one-dimensional way of looking at things. And then we have type, which is looking at these polarities or dichotomies, as they're called, and we have sensing versus intuiting. And there's that word versus. And so that's setting up a polarity, as the word suggests. And it's sort of thinking, well, I scored towards the middle of the spectrum. What does that mean? Or if I'm really far at one end, like really strong intuiting, then can I develop sensing or whatever it is? And again, I feel that's the wrong question. And we can stop and explain to people, oh, no. There's this thing called type development. But that means we have to undo the setup that we already gave them, the visual setup. And wouldn't it be great to simply invite people visually even to see something where there's an empty space that they need to fill? And so I thought with this magic diamond is I took a sort of like that napkin and I put it in the diamond shape and said, let's say there's sensing and intuiting on the axes, or there's thinking, feeling, and we start off undifferentiated. I mean, we have this genetic push, clearly this 40 to 60%. And let's say I'm developing thinking and I'm going along one side of the diamond, but there's this other, not only other side to the diamond, there's a section at the top, which is this empty space, which is where, what is that? It's where sensing and intuiting meet. It's where thinking and feeling meet. And so when people could get their type results, it could be that actually they see it in terms of like, oh, how differentiated is my sensing and how differentiated is my intuiting. And that when they're both differentiated well, you're actually doing activities that blend and combine them in a healthy way. And I really believe that if we just even visually present type in a different way, that people's mindsets when they start will change, and that will invite a growth mindset from the beginning to think like, oh, right, there's this empty space on my chart, my results, whatever it is. And something is supposed to go there. Oh, I'm supposed to be putting something there. What is that? And so that's what I'm working on now is what are the smart ways that we, given where a person starts, that they can, a set of suggestions. How is it that they can fill out that empty space that's blend of not masculine and feminine, but is that blend of sensing and intuiting, or that blend of thinking and feeling, to bring in the opposites and make development implicitly part of type from the first moment that they get some kind of feedback or read the page of a book.
What's so interesting about what you're talking about is we've seen it manifest that people are actually using these more balanced than maybe even they realize. Like at our Profiler training events, where we teach how to help figure out somebody's personality type. One of the things we walk through at the live events is what we call embodiment exercises, and that's getting into the space of each of the cognitive functions. But after we do that, we take these cognitive functions and then have an exercise where we blend them. Like take, for example, extroverted sensing and introverted intuition. We would do an exercise to be as close into extroverted sensing as possible.
Because these are a polarity.
Right. And then as much into introverted intuition as possible. But then we do an exercise where it's heavier on the extroverted sensing side, but includes a component of introverted intuition. And then we do another exercise that's weighted towards introverted intuition, but has a component of extroverted sensing. And what's so interesting is that people who use these, we call them sort of their native functions, like that are part of their first 4 function stack, or what we at Personality Hacker call the CAR model. What's interesting is that when they do the exercise that combines these two sides of the polarity, they realize that that's how they were using it all along. Like they've never actually done a pure expression of extroverted sensing or a pure expression of introverted intuition on down the line. They're always using a little bit of the other side. And then when people become aware of it, now they're able to integrate that part of them more and more. And so that's basically like what you're talking about is basically how it works anyway, if we allow it to naturally do that. And the more we integrate that other side, the more powerful that dominant part becomes, because we're doing things that aren't pushing maybe the sensing side away and focusing too much on the intuition. We're bringing that sensing part, and then that acts as a foundation or like a way for the intuition to grow. And so we've observed that that's basically how people experience it anyway. But you're talking about sort of weaving that idea and making it intrinsic into the model. And I think that brings a whole nother level of awareness of how we're actually operating.
Yeah. And that's, I love the way that you described it. It's like a little bit, the exercises are like a dance in a way for them to get into the mode of experiencing it. I'm reminded when Linda Behrens and I went to the San Francisco Association of Psychological Type meeting a couple of years ago, and Linda was presenting, and she was talking about this very, not exactly development, but talking about cognitive styles. So essentially, like the SFPs and NTJs in one corner, and the NFPs and STJs in another corner, and basically you and your opposite together in the same corner. There were a lot of INTJs in the room that day, people who identify as INTJ pattern. And Linda put up a list and gave out these examples of ways that people would use, say, NI and SE together. And what was so fascinating is that half of the INTJs, including myself, really identified with a lot of these things. And Linda even developed this list without me, but with somebody else. So I just loved being able to see these and saying, yes, I do this, and yes, I do that, in the way that you described. And then there were the other half dozen INTJs who were like, what? No, I don't do this. And what was so interesting as we dug into it, and it became a whole discussion, was whether the environment allowed it to happen or not. So, for example, in my environment for many years as a university instructor, I had tremendous freedom to structure my classes so that people could do outdoor activities. I could teach small seminar style rooms where people would do stuff. Like literally, we would go outdoors with like water guns and tennis balls and like do these sensing activities. And through a like slightly structured process, they would have realizations. So that when we came back and discussed later, it's not me pedantically trying to transmit in some kind of like big insight to them. They come understanding because they did it. In contrast, there was like an INTJ in the room who worked in a corporation doing computer programming, and she had very little flexibility about what she could do. And in her life, in terms of her hobbies, she did some sensing activities, but they were divorced from the intuiting activities. And so that reminds me that where environment comes in is very important, and that in fact people, I think, really benefit from getting these examples that yes, you can do these things. You probably, I think at a low level, people are doing them already, like extroverted thinking with introverted feeling. It's something like, well, here's my to-do list, but I want to prioritize in terms of importance to me personally. What is that going to look like? So I agree absolutely. Like almost everybody, like their co-pilot and their co-pilot's opposite are usually working together in some way. But when it comes to the dominant, the pilot and their opposite, I think some of it really depends upon the environment and whether the environment has given them examples and it like actually allows them time-wise and resource-wise to do it. And so that's where the coaching part comes in, and the growth mindset isn't just in the mind, but is also in the environment. I don't want to belabor that, but I feel that that's like really, really important, that people have the resources and examples to understand like how they can bring the opposites together.
Yeah. So maybe somebody is listening right now that's a little bit new to type. And so I can imagine if you're listening right now and you're like, what are you guys, diamonds development? Like what in the world? Cognitive, like maybe you're new to some of this. So just want to quickly mention, if you're brand new, at personalityhacker.com, we talk a lot about the CAR model, cognitive functions. There's ways to research some of this and get some more information if you're brand new to some of these concepts. But just that diamond idea, Dario, I want to bring some awareness to this. So again, I'm almost imagining it's like a baseball diamond, like an American baseball, where home plate is our starting point, and we've got first base to the right and third base to the left. And what I hear you saying is there's this notion, let's say extroversion is to the right toward first base and introversion is to the left toward third base. I'm an extrovert, so I'm going to start developing along the line toward first base. Like I'm going to start developing. But when I get to first base, at some point in my life, I'm going to start coming back around towards second base, which is directly across from home plate. And I'm going to come back toward maybe more introversion through development in my life. And so I think the idea of timelines is interesting to me. This idea of time, like the distance between home plate and second base directly across, is a time distance. It's over the course of some period of time that I'm developing. And what's interesting is it sounds like my intuition's picking up from this is development starts with more distinction before it's woven together with less distinction. In other words, I become more extroverted all the way to first base in this diamond metaphor. And I'm extreme maybe, or more extreme on the extroversion, but then I round the corner and I begin to weave in more of the introverted parts of myself as I head toward second base, which is the top of the diamond where I'm integrating more of that introverted part of myself. Am I seeing this? Is my intuition picking this up incorrectly, or am I kind of getting a sense of how that might look?
No, that's great. Yeah. I hadn't thought of a baseball diamond, and but that really sets those 4 points that are there. A person doesn't need to become, say, like super extrovert, but the idea is, yes, they need to differentiate in some direction first before they can actually begin some kind of integration process. So the person who says like, oh, I can do all 8 functions, I'm like, first of all, you're probably doing the basic version of all 8 functions, yes, because all of us, can walk down the street, hopefully without being hit by a car, and we can see the trees and so on. All of us can self-reflect or maybe meditate or whatever. We have identity. We pay attention to other people in a basic way. But we want to develop like some, and we do develop specialization. That's the advanced version of each function. And that person is saying, oh, I'm doing the advanced version of each. I'm like, well, that's pretty unlikely. What's likely is that you're still at, first base for some specific things. And yeah, you've gone into the second base, so to speak, that you've woven in some other stuff that's there. And so for the person who's more developed, they can access some of that. But I always think it takes place from it goes back to something Antonia said too. The development takes place within the context of the dominant function. And how we use these other functions is still generally in service of the dominant function. And Roger Pearman, who's been part of the type community, gosh, when did that begin? Since the 1960s. What's true about type? People are wondering, what's true about typing? It's like, well, I'm really pretty confident that everybody has a dominant function. And that really was, Jung presented there's these 8 dominant functions. And that when we do the development further on, that we want to have a really good dominant function so that it creates a really good foundation for all of the development that happens afterwards. But we want to have the development with the growth mindset, not just like, here is my dominant and I don't need anything more. And so that really creates this nice space that we can develop and maybe be like, not only, going in like towards our opposite and bringing, say, extroverted sensing in when we're introverted intuiting, but understanding that bringing in the opposite can actually expand and build upon who we were originally. So the extrovert, natural extrovert, actually eventually their extroverted skills improve. How they work as an extrovert actually improves once they integrate that introverted part of themselves. In other words, the extrovert taking the time to reflect, like, gee, did that meeting we have yesterday, did I do everything that I needed to do? And then go inside themselves and how can I be different? So I see it as like this back and forth process, or the spiral process. Not to mix in yet another metaphor, but the idea of the spiral that, yeah, we begin a little bit undifferentiated, but there's this push in a certain direction. And then maybe we really develop that push and we specialize. And then we go to an opposite direction, sometimes in this fit, whether that's like 6 months or 2 years or whatever. It's like the lawyer who says like, no, I'm going to become an artist. And they do that for a couple of years. And then eventually they find their way back and they integrate that. And I'm not saying that they, do a lawyer for artists or whatever it is, but they integrate those two sides of themselves. And then eventually they can even become stronger at what they were originally in a sort of a fourth act. And so that's, life presents us with the opportunities for acts, and some people close at act 2. And that just stretches on forever. And then other people go for a third act and a fourth act. And that's another metaphor to use.
What's interesting about that idea that there are some that claim that they're using all 8 functions equally strong. My observation has been that oftentimes if a person is actually using the polarity of a cognitive function decently, it almost looks like an even like a third function, like extroverted intuition and introverted sensing, when used in combination with each other, has some properties that can almost look like introverted intuition, which is, I think, some of the reason why even people that are into cognitive functions and really into type and the theory behind it can sometimes get confused around their type and other people's types, because sometimes a polarity will masquerade as even another function, which is why I think it's so important to have maps like this, like your diamond metaphor, it's what's nice is that when you understand the power of weaving in the opposite of these functions, the polarity opposite, and doing growth work on that, sometimes it will, getting really strong at this and getting better at it will cover over other blind spots or other things that might appear to be something that that you're not as naturally or natively strong with. Doing a really good job with your functions and getting them to a high level of development will sometimes make up for some of those blind spots.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's and I think that happens for a couple of reasons. And I love how you say a third function, because Jung said that when this meeting of the opposites occurs in an alchemical way, in other words, like extroverted intuiting, introverted sensing, and the person discovers ways to bring them together, he said how does that happen? He said there's something called the transcendent function that is what is in the psyche that allows this kind of like transcendence or alchemy or blending to occur. And he said that transcendent function actually creates a brand new function that's unique to that person, and in many ways replaces the sort of like standard version of, say, extroverted intuiting that the person had before. That it is something fresh. And that this blended function, this transcendent function, continues to have transcendent qualities. So in a way, it's more open-ended and brings in more of a growth mindset or stretching capacity than the person had before. It's sort of like the saying, nothing succeeds quite like success. And so I believe that that's absolutely, and I've seen that when I would do activities as a teacher that would bring in introverted intuiting and extroverted sensing, that actually created space for people of all types, as long as I framed it right. So sometimes I would have somebody who was like INTP, so introverted thinking, and they don't really want to do either of those functions. They're not excited to get outside and run around physically in an open-ended way and toss a ball and this and that. And so I would leave room in the simulation, the exercise instructions, to say every system needs observers. And if you're really uncomfortable with participating, we actually really could benefit from you taking the time to observe and offer your critique and observations afterward. And so when we come in with, I believe a growth mindset is similar to a systems mindset. That when we bring in our opposite, and almost in order to do that, we had to have found some kind of systems mindset, and we continue with that, and that allows space for people of all types. And so people be like, oh yeah, it really feels like you're doing these other things too. I would add one more point, and that's what you said about native functions, like the top four versus the bottom four, if we're talking about 8. And when I look at people who are now my parents' age, so people in their 70s, I see, again, like this interesting difference between those who I feel like all of them developed their native functions and found some synergies and resolved polarities and so on with those. Those who only focused on the top 4 tend to have blind spots that only appeared at like 65 plus. Because I think even the sort of the magic of type development will carry us only so far. And that those who went and developed not just the native functions, but the shadow functions as well, like didn't end up with those same problems. And so I think it's really worthwhile, even though people can be lulled into the sense of complacency. Oh yeah, I've so well developed myself. I've done, say it's the ENFJ who's also really well developed introverted thinking and extroverted sensing, but it's still within the framework of their top 4. And did they really go on then and push? And probably that was like a burst of energy in that development. The developing the sort of the polarities there, those top 4 that carried them for 20 years. And it's like, I think in surfing, it's like a really great wave that can carry you into the shore and in a beautiful way. But then once you get there, then what? And so it really is helpful for people to look at all 8 eventually. But I do think it's almost another topic then to say, how do we develop like the 7th and 8th functions safely? Because they compete with and almost override the primary, like the pilot and co-pilot, which we don't want, maybe. So what are safe ways to do that? And that may be a whole other topic. But when we get into the nitty-gritty of development, I'm saying that there's also some pieces of wisdom there we want to keep in mind, and not just be like, oh, develop however you can.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that that's important to remember, that there is sequence and strategy to growth, including the four, what is often called the shadow functions. And so I think one of the reasons why we always say at Personality Hacker, if we're in a soundbite world, if we can get one soundbite across, it's grow the auxiliary or the co-pilot. And it seems that that is a kickoff point to a lot of other sort of natural growth that happens, but you want the natural growth to happen as well. You don't want to stop it at the fourth function, or what we call the 3-year-old. There is more that happens beyond that. It's just there's sequence and strategy. And so, like as a certain types, you wouldn't want to ignore like your auxiliary co-pilot in favor of, say, your 6th function first. But there is a moment when that 6th function becomes very important. So understanding sort of the how that plays out. And you're right, that is a topic for another time, which I would love to get into for sure. So just kind of wrapping all of this up, in conclusion, what it sounds like to me is, as far as the original question, does your personality change? The answer is, in observable ways, yeah, to the outside world, it will very much appear as if your personality is changing. But if we define personality as a series of stable components within a personality, and if a person's type seems to be at least 40 to 60% influenced by maybe genetics, and another percentage of it is cemented by the environment, but a good percentage of it appears to have a decent amount of evidence to indicate that we come sort of packaged with this, then it doesn't appear as if those stable components, those don't change. And personality types, as it's sort of related to things like cognitive functions and those components, those don't change. But if you don't make it a fixed part of your identity, if you don't make it or amalgamize it into a fixed mindset, then within that parameter, there's lots of exciting development that happens within it. And there's lots of apparent changes that happen within an individual as they grow and mature. So is that basically the conclusion that we're all coming to at this point?
Yeah. And another little phrase that I've heard in psychology is that when people, grow in a healthy way, they are who they've always been, only more so. In the sense of bringing out truly like the gifts and the, not just the strengths, but the potential. And that's so important to understand that, when we look at the DNA genome, that's all about potential. And it's a set of instructions and in a sense, strategies. And what we do with that potential then depends upon our choices, environment, all of these things. And there is the capacity for development. There's that potential, and how much are we going to tap that? And as we do, still we're operating from that base of potential. It's like when I used to introduce temperament in my classes, and one of the components that introduce a temperament is how we change. And each type deals with adaptation and change in a different way. And they're like, oh, so you don't change temperament. Temperament is about your strategy for change.
That's a perfect way of articulating it. And so, so I think if a person is going to use, just in that original foundational question, I think if a person is going to use personality type to let themselves off the hook in terms of growth, if they're going to use it to say, well, this is just what and who I am, and I'll use this sort of 2-paragraph description to give myself permission to just always be whatever I'm stuck in the mud around, then maybe it's best for you to think that personality type is bullshit. Like maybe that's the thing you should think, because it's not doing what the original tool was intended to do, which according to this conversation is actually powerful tools for transformation. And just like you mentioned, it's not that you don't change, it's that it helps diagnose how you change. So I think from this conversation, what I'm picking up is, if you use the tool as it was originally intended, and as like the handlers of the tool are more and more encouraging, which is growth and development, then it can be really powerful for great adaptation and transformation. But if you use it as an excuse for a fixed mindset, maybe it's best that you don't use it at all.
So Dr. Nardi, you are working on, and by the time this recording, somebody might hear this, it's already published, but it's going to be coming out soon. So we don't need to give the date on here. But what is the title of the book you're working on?
Well, those are always things that need to pass through the marketing filter. The title,
Gotcha.
is my working title is The Magic Diamond,
Fantastic.
which is not really great for Amazon search, but there'll be a subtitle, something along the lines of 8 paths to leveling up in life, or 8 paths to coaching development, something like that. And but people need only search for my name, and they will find the book. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to keep with The Magic Diamond as its title.
Okay. Either way, we'll update a link below this podcast with the direct link to the book once it's published. So if you're listening right now and it's in a future date, not the time of the recording this was released, we'll have that link underneath this podcast.
Well, and we've gotten a little bit of sneak preview into what Dario has been working on. It's really good stuff. It's very exciting. So I highly recommend that at the time of this recording that you anticipate, and then maybe if you're listening to it at a future date, that you go look it up, because it's really good stuff.
Well, actually, that's what I want to encourage you to do. If you're listening right now, we typically at the end of our podcast talk about our book, Personality Hacker, but instead of looking at that right now, go over to Amazon, look up Dr. Nardi and get one of his resources, get one of his books. Let's support what he's doing, the work he's been putting into this for years. He's put a lot of effort and work into type development, talking about typology. And I want to encourage someone listening right now to support you, Dr. Nardi, because I think the stuff you're doing is really cool.
Thank you. And I do see what I've been doing as continuing a long line of work, going back to Jung and possibly people before that. And I have to mention Linda Behrens and others, over the course of 3 decades, really trying to highlight the power of type and the magic of it. Jung described the types as a mandala, and that every time we come back to it, that we can, if we wish, discover something new about ourselves, other people, the world, and that it is this prompt for development.
Dr. Nardi, thank you so much for being on with us today. This has been fantastic. A lot of intuition stuff comes up for me, and I'm like, I want to go down all these rabbit trails of you. So we have to have you on in the future at some point, because it's been a great conversation. So if you are listening along and something's been coming up for you, maybe you've got a question, a comment, you'd like to share your story about your own type development, something that maybe you've been through in your own life. You've seen the developmental model of type show up for you personally. We'd love to hear from you directly below this episode. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Ask your question, leave your comment, share your story. We want your voice to be heard. You're the 4th person in this conversation, but you didn't have a microphone, and now it's time for your voice to be heard.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review, that helps us out a lot. And also, we usually talk about our book, but I'm going to actually recommend you go to Amazon to go check out Dr. Dario Nardi's series of books. There are some really great ones in there. The Neuroscience of Personality, 8 Steps to Self-Leadership. Is that the title of it, Dario?
8 Keys to Self-Leadership.
8 Keys. I just know that I reference it all the time. So it's a great book. And he's got a series of other books that he's also produced with Linda Behrens that are fantastic, that we use them as reference points all the time. And of course, his newest book about the Diamond Method. So go check him out and leave him a rating and review on his books. That I'm sure would help him out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.